Hi, I'm Michelle Fenton, and welcome to the Happitecture Podcast. What would it take to develop resilient, sustainable communities? How do we design cities that support our collective happiness? Join me as my guests and I discuss how we can plan, implement, and foster places that allow us to flourish and grow. In today's episode, I'm honored to welcome Dr. June Francis to the Happitecture Podcast. Dr. Francis is an associate professor of marketing, co-founder of the Collab Project, and special advisor to the president of SFU on Diaspora Research and Engagement. Help me welcome Dr. June Francis. It is my privilege and honor today to have a very special guest with us on this podcast, June Francis. And as we were chatting earlier, June, we could just have a special podcast on like all the things you bring to the table, all of your credentials. But let's start with a special advisor to the president at SFU on Antiracism, chair of Hogans Alley Society, associate professor of marketing at Simon Fraser University, co-founder of the Collab Project, director of the Institute of Diaspora Research and Engagement at SFU. You've won several awards for service and teaching excellence. You are an advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion for racialized groups and advancement of non-traditional intellectual property laws. I mean, we could go on, but I would love to just dive into all of this. What drives you to bring this work into such sharp focus?
Well, I always have to remember who I am. And I think that's those are all descriptions of various roles I play and formalizing them into titles. But if I think about who I am the descendant of slave. I'm a descendant of slaves. I was brought to this part of the world, not of my own or my ancestors' own making. And so I always remind myself that I was the seventh child of parents who were born into colonial Jamaica. I myself was at the end of the colonial period, but born in as a colonial subject. In my journey from Jamaica was a product of neocolonial forces that we had actually thought that colonization had ended.
Right. Don't we all think that?
Yeah, but very quickly it became clear that was what we had fought for and thought that was we'd arrived. But I just want to pay homage as well to the number of slave rebellions that occurred in Jamaica, because we were quite pivotal. Let's just recognize that the narrative that talks about, the emancipation of slaves as something that was bestowed on us. Essentially, it was a result of slave rebellions that finally brought the end of slavery.
Right.
And I from the
institutionalized slavery. Let's just
institutionalized
be really
slavery.
clear
Let's
about
be clear on that.
Yeah.
The formal thing they call it, even that didn't end for another
Right.
few years with indentureships and various other things. So, yeah, that's who I am, and I think it's really important in terms of what is for me to think about myself that way.
Well, that's incredible. I want to drill down a little bit in terms of your role on the Hogans Alley Society and as advisor to the president in terms of anti-racism. I mean, this is something that we're going to start hearing a lot. We've heard a lot about, but unless you're in that group, you probably haven't. A lot of our listeners may not have heard about this. Let's start with Hogans Alley. What is the idea of Hogans Alley in the resurgence of the Hogans Alley Society? And how does that relate to your work at SFU, if at all?
Yes. So one of the things that is really important to recognize that situates Hogans Alley is that space is not neutral. Right? Space is racialized. What I mean by that is that part of a white supremacist society or a white settler society or a colonial society was the idea that prime space or certain spaces belonged to the ruling class, the dominant class, often the white class. And that other people were relegated. And in the case of Canada, of course, the indigenous people were taken off their land and put in reservations. So space has always been a place reserved and connected to power. So the people in power held space.
Yes.
And likewise, they relegated other people to less desirable spaces.
Right.
And that's why today we talk about environmental racism, for example. The fact that people are put in places that often are not only relegated, but circumscribed, that rules are put in place to keep these people away from other places, and often those places are treated very poorly.
Yes.
In the case of Hogans Alley, we have the situation in Vancouver, which was a segregated city. Let's be really clear that Vancouver was a segregated city. So Black people and other racialized groups coming into Vancouver, and at that time, a number of white groups were racialized as well, Italians and others. And these people were not allowed to live anywhere, on the way, just anywhere.
Right.
And they found an enclave that they built, a community in what is now called Strathcona. We call it Black Strathcona. But it really was a community of a very large, the majority of the Black community in Vancouver, as well as other racialized groups, and then and if you go further, the Chinese as well. So you have this community where the Black community has a church, has developed a community. 800 people are on the rolls of the church. This is where the Pullman porters who come across this, who were really the slaves on the trains, because they were not allowed as Black people to rise above the sleeping car porters. And so they were the lowest rung on the trains, and it was a replica, by the way, of the antebellum South. The idea of Black people serving you.
Yes.
And these people mostly had to rely on tips. So very, very low, very, very, very humiliating positions they occupied. But there was no ability for them to sleep on the train, except when no white person was around. And when they got to the cities, there was no place for them to go. But they could find home in Hogans Alley. Likewise, performers coming through Vancouver. Louis Armstrong, people could not stay in the white areas.
Right.
So they stayed in these areas. And so they had created for themselves a community with stores, with shops, with businesses. People owned their land. Most people rented, but nonetheless, this is their home community. And of course, across this country, whenever the idea occurred, and this occurred during what we call urban renewal, and it's important to think about urban renewal as projects designed to create enclaves of white individuals, and then the street system and the networks to get them to these suburbs.
Yeah.
And they always, right, they looked around and thought, where will we destroy in order to build these highways?
Right, and Hogans Alley is
and
a great
Hogans
example.
Alley, exactly, was slated.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how it's always done with a plan. So the plan was to of course, destroy Hogans Alley and put the viaduct there. And in order to implement it, it was really important to make Hogans Alley to denigrate it. In other words, to start to think about Hogans Alley as a blight. Right. So they stopped collecting garbage. The services were withdrawn. There's Randy Clark, who's a descendant who lived there, recounts one of the most heart-wrenching stories as a child, the only bike he ever owned as a child. And he came home one day and creosote had been sprayed on the street, a toxic substance, and it was sprayed over his bike. And every time I remember that story, I am actually driven to tears of a young boy who the only community had his grandmother, had a bar in the neighborhood. I mean, it was a thriving place.
Yes.
And yet, this is what he experienced. And so people started to protest. They tried to get the city to give them grants and other things because they started to say, well, you're not upkeeping your lot. They always constructed so that by the time the citizens hear that it's been destroyed, they're all on side,
right,
because it's the den, it's the red light district, it's where it's the poor part.
It's almost a campaign.
Yes, the crime infested, derelict place. And so some people started to move out earlier when they realized this was deteriorating. Others stayed to the bitter end, but nonetheless, they destroyed Hogans Alley with a highway to nowhere, because as we all know, the Georgia viaduct was stopped by the Chinese community, who had a lot more numbers and power, and so the highway was never completed, but the viaduct remained.
I mean, that really goes to the point that space, even though we, as architects and designers think of space as this benign thing that we then create within, has so much power and intensity in how we wield that power, how we as a colonial structure wield that power. And, one of the things I'm struck by is, even though Hogans Alley was a complete community, there was still this lack of sense of belonging to the whole. And one of the things that we see here in Vancouver is that even though you might be in different communities, if you're in this sort of framework of a colonialized society, colonialized framework, you belong, even though you're in very unique communities. And yet here we are, Hogans Alley, being removed from that belonging, that sense of belonging.
Right.
And so I want to segue back into the role of an advisor for anti-racism, and I imagine considering space in that regard, not just, space, policy, hiring practices, all that stuff. And how is it that we stop this destruction of the sense of belonging? People who, let's be honest, unless you're Indigenous to Canada, we're all visitors here.
Right.
Although
I do make a distinction that people who were forcibly, some of us came, but of course, many generations back of Black people in Nova Scotia and other places in Canada, and they also migrated, and we think about the pioneers who came up. Mm-hmm. I just want to acknowledge that especially the descendants of slaves, and both of them are descendants of slaves. Mm-hmm. Their arrival was forced.
Right.
So I make that distinction.
That's a good distinction.
But I want to go back to this idea of space and universities and being the advisor on anti-racism. Universities are arguably one of the most white supremacist, and I say that, and I'll explain why I use that term, colonial structure.
Okay.
White supremacists in the sense that the idea, universities were built around, you might say, European-centered notions, colonial, and what universities aspired to do and did do in Canada was to promote ideas primarily from the European tradition.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So
I think no one would disagree with that.
Right. So if you think about the courses, the classes, what you learn as an architect, what I learn as a business in my business program, what you learn in sociology and philosophy, the Greeks, etc. All of it is to aggrandize and to valorize and to focus our attention on European achievements. Mm-hmm. And what that means is the exclusion of other histories, other philosophies, other ways of knowing, other intellectual traditions.
Well, certainly when I learned architecture, I can't remember learning anything outside of a European architecture, a European philosophy of architecture.
Exactly. And some of the work, I hope we'll get to a little bit on some work we do with the Parks Board as well. But it's around this idea that that everything about the university, right? Particularly by in some ways you could call it a European indoctrination. It has created self-hate in some people because, of course, in the sense that we believe that our ideas are not as valuable.
Right.
Somehow we didn't accomplish quite as much. Because if the grand university hasn't thought fit to talk about us, then it means that we don't belong. So it's not only the physical space, which I will get to in a moment, but everything about universities signal that. So if you go to the libraries, you will find books, a preponderance of books that support one set of European-based ideas. If you go into a class and look at all the ways, the courses, it could go health science. It doesn't matter what you look at. All of it tends to be almost universally about European ideas, including med schools where the doctors once told me they couldn't find my vein because they didn't learn how to access veins on dark skin.
Right.
So everything valorizes and gives advantage, therefore, to one group. So even if we're racialized people, we're learning the same stuff.
Right.
And that's why Bob Marley told us to emancipate ourselves, my compatriot Bob Marley, from mental slavery.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
Because that's the beginning of it all. But part of that also is that when we're in those spaces, we are not represented. We do not actually belong.
Right.
We're sort of interlopers into somebody else's world. And so we're made to feel like we're being invited in. So let me get to this advisor. I will get to it. Is that even if you look at Arthur Erickson's award-winning Burnaby Mountain design, that's a design that when I first was interviewing at SFU, I actually thought the university hadn't yet been finished. I was wondering why, after all these years, they hadn't finished the university. Because for my aesthetic, unpainted concrete is got to be one of the grayest, most uninspiring, and even the layout of the place did not hit my eye with any kind of joy. Certainly, I knew I was not in a place that I belonged physically. And we also have instances at SFU, including the arrest not too long ago of a black student who was seeking refuge on the campus. And the way it was done was also a questioning of him. He had to prove that he belonged there.
Right. It's not assumed automatically.
It's not assumed. And the Black Student Union, this Black Students Association at SFU, SOCA, has spent a lot of time over the years because they were displaced from their room that they had, and they argued we need a black space. And only recently, we're now in the process of returning that student society to a black space, and it's on their advocacy.
Yeah.
So we really are seen as not as marginally belonging. So when this Black Lives Matter protest occurred, and I was being pulled in a million directions around contributing to all of a sudden a new awakening, a new set of perceived interest in blackness and what does it mean for exclusion. And when people started to have the conversations, I really felt that the university was a place that fundamentally had to understand that right across its research, its pedagogy, its physical space, its policies, how it hires, how it promotes,
how it recruits,
who gets tenure.
Yes.
All of those things excluded black faculty and staff and students.
Right.
And therefore Canadian society, right? We are a pillar of the society. So I was, me and others got together and formed the Black Caucus, where we pulled the students together and started to really call on the university in a much more assertive way to recognize the great harm. And we started to collect stories of students. And I got to tell you that even though I know students were excluded, because often I get black students coming to me saying that I can't get a supervisor because they don't understand my work.
Right.
I need you to help supervise me. And often I do it off the corner of my desk. Or to just support them, or to just say hi, I know how you must feel, to talk with them about the fact that they don't even have food they can tolerate. All the ways in which Black faculty spend a lot of time on unpaid work to try and support our communities. When I listened to those students and I heard the degree of hurt, I remember one student saying that I'm dying to leave so I can get over the trauma of university. When this should have been a joyous time.
Well, that's what I was just gonna get into a little bit. Is like when we talk about universities, and when we perceive as universities and not see the guardrails of colonialism. You know, if we're ignorant to those, we think of university as a thriving place of ideas, of inclusivity, of diversity, of, you know, pushing the envelope. And so what better place to start this dialogue and to start looking at different ways of designing places, not just places, but policies and, like you say, recruitment, promotion, all that stuff for inclusion. Yeah. And specifically for not inclusion in a check the box kind of way, but to talk about real belonging.
Right.
You know,
belonging. Yeah.
You know, it's not like, okay, we've included you. It's that you actually feel that you are part of that community and in an integrated kind of way.
Right.
So I actually want to talk about, because colonialism has come up a lot, and as it will, and we're seeing that conversation happen, not just in Black communities, but certainly in Indigenous communities. Right. When we talk about colonialism and we start thinking about it, I think we can, if we actually are genuine, we can start to see the structures all around us.
Right.
Let's talk about decolonialism.
Right.
Because to me, as an architect, that is the promise of a better society, a more resilient society, a happier society, and hence the Happitecture Podcast. Not to be tongue-in-cheek about Happitecture, but I mean, there are things that we as a society can do, structures that we can rethink, that actually promote happiness and resiliency in communities. And so let's talk about decolonialization.
I love that subject. So first of all, I just want to just make this point. So when the president asked me if I would serve as the advisor for a limited time, because I'm not part of the establishment and I like to keep my soul independent, I did agree. And it's because I did see some evidence of taking it seriously. I want to talk about decolonialism, and I'm going to start by talking about the course I teach. I teach a course to the Indigenous students, leaders. SFU has a master's program in executive business education, only one in the country, I think the only one in North America. And I teach the marketing course.
Amazing.
Right?
Yeah.
So what do we do, right? This is marketing. And likewise, all design fields were the purveyors of colonialism, right?
Yes.
They created the structural realities and the aesthetic realities to reinforce ideas.
Yes. I mean, I often say that my role as an architect, for better or worse, is to concretize the powers that are in place.
Right. And we know that. You go into a bank and they make you line up a certain way, sit a certain place.
Yes.
So these places are all designed. And marketing, likewise, is just a set of ideas. But the visual, it's probably appropriate to say that marketing was quite instrumental in bringing to the mass market racism. Mm-hmm. Because it was through these ideas that you know, at the time, and you know, early imperialism, many people didn't read, but they could decode physical things, and they could decode marketing, right? Marketing concepts. So you saw the Pear soap, right? That, you know, cleaning off black skin meant creating purity, that kind of thing. So coming back to my marketing course, I see it as a course that was designed to support colonial structures. And in the case of Canada, Indigenous people were a major object of that colonial process.
For more information on this or any other episodes of the Happitecture Podcast, you can find us at happitecture.com. HAPPITECTURE.com. Special thanks to our sponsors, Cora Architecture and Interiors, designing places for being. Post-production by Vanessa Hennessy.